Madam Chair, the meeting is live now.
Okay, thanks, Saruka. All right, thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's Regional Watershed Advisory Board. I'd first like to start out by acknowledging that although we are joining virtually, many of us are based out of Shabuktuk or Halifax, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So we're all treaty people, and it's an ongoing learning process for me and many of us to learn our role in upholding those treaties. So first item on the agenda is a call to order. So I think rather than doing the hello and roundtable camera audio check and then the community announcements, I think I'm just going to combine those. So David, if you'd like to start by testing your camera and audio, and also if you have any water-related announcements or news that you'd like to share.
Yep, hopefully everybody can hear me all right. No special water announcements, though the water is flowing again as we move into fall, and my own research out in the Aquatic Watersheds getting exciting out there as the streams start to fill up and all these little channels that disappear in the summer start to fill with water again. And it's just all kinds of excitement out there.
Very cool. Nice. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, next on the list we have Robert, but I don't see him in attendance, and neither is Farhang, so I'll go to Yuji next, please.
Hi everyone, this is Yuji, testing my sound. Just quick, I guess, ocean technology related events happening in the next few weeks or so, organized by one of the ecosystem player, Innovacorp, Nova Scotia Innovation Corporation. It's called the Cove Startup Yards Investment Readiness Session for Ocean Technology Companies. You can check out these events on Innovacorp's website.
Cool, thank you. Okay, we don't have Andrew, so I'd like to, or Tony, so Sayo, you're next. You're just on mute.
Yes, present.
Sure.
Yeah, no announcements.
Okay. I don't have a local announcement, but an interesting water-related news. I was reading a little bit about some of the flooding in British Columbia, and something you said, David, made me think of this, but there's an article about how forestry practices has exacerbated a lot of the flooding because of how with clear cutting, the tree roots stay in the soil and they absorb a lot more water and can kind of contribute and exacerbate these landslide conditions because of that more waterlogged soil. So I thought that was an interesting convergence of how land use practices influence what happens on the landscape with water. All right, so I think that's all we have. We have a few staff joining us. So Emma, if you'd like to turn your camera on and if you have anything to share.
Hi everybody, nothing too exciting to share. Also just kind of thinking of what's happening on the West Coast, and yeah, that's all for me.
Oh, thank you. And we have Michael and John as well, and they'll be presenting shortly. So if you'd like to turn on your camera now and test your sound, you can do that, but I'm not sure if you already did that or not, and we'll be hearing from you soon. So we have item number 3 here, approval of minutes from our August 12th meeting. Did anyone find any errors or omissions in the minutes?
Yeah, so I didn't feel that the linkage that Andrew and I we thought we'd been very clear on between development and the causal chain between development, or a potential causal chain between development, phosphorus loadings, something that Andrew sees as inevitable. The development will lead to higher phosphorus loadings. That will lead to lower oxygen levels, or can, and that can lead to arsenic being liberated from the lake bottom. That was not reflected, and I had taken great care, I think, to draw that chain out and discuss it during the meeting with Andrew, but it didn't show up in the minutes. So I can't sign off on them in the current form. Doesn't reflect what I said.
Okay. Haruka, do you have any feedback on what we can do next?
Yes, thank you through you to the board members. So I just take notes on the points that Seo mentioned. So I'm going to include that on the minutes, and then also Seo and chair and vice chair, if you get to review before I finalize. So committee members, sorry, board members can share anything that the board members want to add on and just pass the minutes as amended. And then I'll make sure to include all the points, and I'll make sure you get the review before I post it on halifax.ca as well.
Great, thank you. Are there any other comments about the minutes? Okay, so it sounds like we will not make a motion to approve those until we have a chance to review the updated minutes that Haruka will update based on your comments. So thank you for making those. That's exactly why we ask for approval of minutes, to make sure that everything we say is perfect. All right, thank you for joining us, Tony, just in time.
For the delay, I had the wrong time in my schedule.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so we are at number 4 here, approval of the order of business. So we'd like to make a change in the order of the agenda to move the staff meeting up before the external presentation, just because there's Linda Campbell hasn't joined the meeting yet, so we want to make sure she's here to present. So Haruka, will I need to have a motion to change the order, or?
Just to mention that item 10.2.1 will be dealt with before the item 8.3, and then board members can pass the motion to approve the order of business as amended, and that'll be sufficient.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to make a change to the agenda to add item 10.2.1 to be ahead of item 8.3.1. So I need a mover and a seconder for that motion, please.
I'll move or second.
David moves and
Second it.
Tony seconds. Perfect, thank you. So all those in favor, can wave your hand. Okay, perfect. So the motion carries, and we've changed the agenda order. So number 5, business arising out of the minutes. Is there any business arising from the minutes? Any follow-up items in addition to, say, what you already mentioned about making those amendments? All right, so we're at number 6, call for declaration of conflict of interests. Does anyone have a conflict to declare as a result of an agenda item? All right, so there's number 7, no deferred business to consider. And now we are at correspondence. So we do have an item of correspondence from Chris Elson that was originally received on August 19th, just after our August meeting. I will give a bit of an overview of what this correspondence entailed. So there are several pictures included of, it looks like a fair amount of sediment and mud and kind of foam in a watercourse and wetland area near Lake Morris. So I'll just summarize Chris's email here. So he was in the Portland Estates area and the Morris Lake area. And he was surprised and concerned to note considerable quantities of mud in a usually crystal clear brook, a short distance from the access point at the end of Diana Grace Avenue. So he went back to that place and discovered that the marsh at the source of that brook is also extremely muddy. So he's wondering if that could be due to low water levels and whether there was an inappropriate release of earth or clay into the marsh system from a source that he could not locate. So please advise, he says, if you could consider some sort of visit to determine the nature of this silting. One of the photos shows the muddy rocks and discolored water at the point where the brook empties into Morris Lake. This cannot be good for the lake. There's so much mud that I fear it could impact the marsh significantly as well. Does anyone have any questions or comments related to that correspondence?
Well, I guess, is there a standard way that the city would respond to something like that? Do they send someone to investigate? Is there a protocol for that kind of citizen observation?
I wonder, Emma, if you could answer that. This email was received back in August, so maybe you received it at the same time.
I did. I did also received it. So what I did was I emailed where it was kind of identified in the email. My understanding was that like they thought it might be from the storm pipe or some kind of waterway into the lake itself. So I forwarded the photos on to colleagues of mine within infrastructure and planning, other engineer in the engineering department, and asked them if they could take a look into it, if they knew of any construction happening in the area. They went and investigated it soon after. So I think I received it the end of August, and so I was just pulling up the correspondence. They identified it to be coming from Halifax Water stormwater system. So I then forwarded it on to Halifax Water stormwater system, and they investigated it, but I didn't hear anything further on what they found, if there was some kind of issue or if it was just kind of like a large heavy storm event that happened. So the process is that we do go investigate if it is Halifax infrastructure, and then if it's Halifax Water infrastructure, then we inform them as well.
Okay. I guess my next question is, do we intend to reply, or does the city intend to reply to the email?
I think I did respond to him. I'm trying to remember what's happened in the last few months, and let him know that like we were investigating it, and and thanked him for sending in that information.
So more of an acknowledgement than a sort of an explanation of what's happening.
Yeah, because like I'm looking through my correspondence, and I didn't hear back from Halifax Water of like, oh, it was this, thanks for letting us know. But they did respond promptly saying that they would look into it. So
okay, any follow-ups since then?
No, but I can look into it further.
Yeah, I guess
I think the ideal circumstance is that we would get a reply from Halifax Water and be able to close the loop with the citizen who wrote in.
Yeah. Tony, you were going to comment on something?
So, yeah, just echoing, CO's suggestion there. There should be some follow-up. So if Halifax Water has investigated, they should be able to provide a response. Maybe if we could ask Emma to just nudge them a little bit to see if they can get a response back.
Yeah, I can do that.
Great, thank you. Yuji, David, did you have any comments?
I don't have any further comments, just respecting city staffs and process.
Yeah, similar here. It's always, it would always be good to follow up, of course, with the person who reported it with whatever was found. But hopefully Halifax Water will be a little bit more forthcoming in sharing anything they have found, or even that they haven't found anything.
Thanks for joining us, Andrew. We're just going through from the Palace of Versailles, wherever you might be. We're just going through some correspondence that was received by the committee from Chris Elson. If you'd like to jump in with a comment, you're welcome to do so. Emma Waddy was just saying back in August when it was originally received, she had forwarded a request for information to infrastructure and planning, and was then forwarded on to Halifax Water. And we were just discussing that it'll be good to give Halifax Water a bit of a prod to see if they're able to actually provide a bit more follow-up information about whether they found out anything about the source of the sediment.
Thanks, Emma. Sorry I'm late. Problem at daycare pickup.
No
Nice
worries.
digs.
Life happens. All right. So options available to the board: receive and take no actions, receive and respond to Chris Elson, to acknowledge the correspondence, any other action the legislative assistant can be followed up after the meeting. All right. So perhaps we can respond to Chris and thank him for the correspondence, and mention that we brought it up at the meeting, and that Emma had followed up on her end as best she could at the time in August, and that we requested she follow up again with Halifax Water, and then we can get in touch with them if there are any further updates. And Haruka, I can't remember, is it me that can respond directly to Chris, or does that information go through you?
You may respond back to Chris, but make sure you include my email as well, just for the recording purpose.
Okay, I will do that. All right, so item 8, or are there any further last comments on this correspondence before we move on? All right, item 8.2, there are no petitions. We are skipping 8.3 and going to 10.2, items from committee members. So Tony has brought an item forward relating to Burnside and City of Lakes development. Would you like to provide some background information before we get into the presentation?
You're asking me?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so this was an item that just came to my attention recently. Back in October, there had been an HRM staff report to council regarding the development of the next phase of Burnside Industrial Park. And so I had a look at the staff report, and it raised a number of questions. And I think the board members have received a copy of the questions that I had sent through the clerk's office. So just, I won't restate all of it, but just to go through very briefly. So it raised concerns for me about clearing a very large area of land, about 120 acres. Looking at the maps, it looks like that's, something on the same scale of Dartmouth Crossing. So it's a large area to be completely cleared. It's not, disturbed at the moment, as far as I can tell. So this would involve removing all the vegetation, a lot of the soil, grading the lots, putting in infrastructure such as roads and water and sewer. So the questions it raises for me are, what will be done to control the stormwater runoff from this area as it's being cleared, and then once it is cleared during further development of the area for businesses and selling of lots and buildings and so on. The report itself states that there are, and I quote, "there are no substantial environmental implications associated with the recommendations in this report." And the report is advising council, and it was approved to go ahead and award the contract to begin this clearing operation. But the report does not make clear what the basis is for that conclusion of no substantial environmental implications. It doesn't say what information was available or what was considered, what study or data it might have been based on. It only says an approved plan for erosion and sediment control will be provided by the contractor, but it doesn't say anything about what that would contain or what information it would provide. So my questions are, where does this area drain to? And looking at maps, it appears to me that it will mostly drain into Lake William, with the possibility of also Anderson Lake, which is a small lake that drains into Bedford Basin. So I want to know, and I've had the clerk forward these questions to HRM staff, so not to put them on the spot, I don't expect a response right now. But during the clearing phase, how will stormwater be managed and collected and controlled? Will there be any level of treatment of stormwater, control of sedimentation? And then subsequently during the development phase, will this area be connected to the existing stormwater system in Burnside Park? It appears to me you'd have to go over a height of land in order to make that connection. And I know that Halifax Water usually tries to avoid pumping stormwater. So that implies that it might follow the natural drainage to Lake William. So my question is, how will that stormwater be controlled? How will it be treated? What will the impacts be on Lake William and downstream areas? Lake William drains into Lake Thomas and then further into Grand Lake. So those were my basic questions about the stormwater. I also wanted to ask HRM whether their lake monitoring program will be to any degree up and running before this activity begins. It would be great to have some background water quality data on Lake William and perhaps Anderson Lake, at least, if not Lake Thomas. And I don't know what the status is of their monitoring program, so I don't know if they're going to be able to get out and get any level of background data, which would have to start, I think, fairly soon, because I understand the contract to start the operations there is going to be starting fairly soon. But the point being that, you would be in a much better position to detect impacts if you've got some background data. Now, HRM does have historical data on Lake William and Thomas, but that's from a number of years ago. It would be nice to know what the state is now and then be able to compare that to, any subsequent years as this project goes forward and see what the impacts might be. So that was my concern and questions, and we've had it referred through the clerk to HRM, and I guess we'll see what transpires, what comes forward from them as a response.
Great. Thank you, Tony, for that background. Why don't we dive right into the staff presentation, and then we can get into question period discussion after that. So John and or Michael, if you're ready to present.
Hi there. I think this is Michael Weil. I'm the Manager of Acquisitions, Disposals, and Industrial Lands for HRM. Hopefully my camera and microphone are working at this point. My colleague, John Fawcett, I think John has maybe having a little difficulty with his camera and his microphone. And he would have the key details for us. But yes, just to start, as Tony indicated, Regional Council awarded the tender for construction of Phase 13-1 Burnside, approximately 120 net acres of new industrial lot inventory. Phase 13 has been delayed for a few years now while we're awaiting the extension of the Provincial Highway 107 project and the construction of the interchange that will connect the lands of Phase 13. Prior, they had been sort of landlocked, I guess, by the Highway 107 as it existed and as it goes into Acreley Boulevard. As Tony indicated, just in a comparison to Dartmouth Crossing, this is not the same size. Again, this is 120 acres. Dartmouth Crossing is 511 acres, so not the same size for sure. This was an as-of-right development, meaning it's zoned and service land already programmed for the expansion of Burnside, and phase 13 will be constructed over 3 sub-phases from the current phase 13-1 to phase 13-2 and phase 13-3 to follow as market demand and supply warrants. Overall, John, I'm not sure if your system is up and working, that you can provide the presentation. I know John has prepared a presentation to follow along in the basic form of the questions that had been presented by Tony. I'll take that John still isn't working.
John, this is Aoyama speaking. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, there's the call-in number as well. So you may alternatively calling into the meeting and speak to the slides. I will be able to share the slides for you.
Perhaps as well, if you're able to use the chat function. Oh, he did. Okay, great.
There, I almost got lost here in the system trying to share it. So Aruka, I think you indicated that you can share this slideshow. Okay, great. Okay, as we go through, if you want to go to the next screen. So this is a general indication of where phase 13 is located. You'll see to the south of where phase 13 is roughly sketched in would be what's known as phase 12 Burnside, which then connects to, I guess, probably at the bottom right of the picture, for a landmark for folks would be the IKEA building in Dartmouth Crossing, and the top portion of phase 13 to the western tip would be up against the Provincial Correctional Facility. So this would be at the top of current Acreley Boulevard and where it meets with the Highway 107 extension. I think this map gives a good indication of the proximity to Lake Charles and Lake William. McGregor Brook runs through phase 13 as well. And we have the Municipal Dexter Quarry to the northwest. Okay, next slide if we could. The entire sketch here is showing what is known as phase 13. The highlighted portion, or the dark outline portion, would be phase 13-1. To the west of that, phase 13-2 will follow in sequence to connect to our second interchange. And the final project of phase 13 would be phase 13-3 to the eastern portion of this. Okay, if you'd like to advance to the next slide. This sketch would be good if we had, if John was able to be on audio here to better describe what he was depicting in this plan. Shows a little bit of where I believe, John, where the stormwater and the natural water courses are directed and will continue to be directed. If you want to go to the next slide. Again, phase 13-1 in particular, McGregor's Brook flows to the, I guess it'd be north or northeast. And we can go to the next slide. A little bit of information on the stormwater ponds that'll be put in place. For the most part, for new lots being created, they'll be doing a containment of stormwater on their property and the process of release to handle that stormwater flow. And if we can advance to the next screen. It just gives a little bit of the indication of the major culverts that'll be located in phase 13-1. And I think as we get to the next screen, we should be at the part where we're starting to answer the questions. Here we go. So yes, and I believe Tony indicated a little bit of this in his opening talk, that the stormwater will be managed during construction. The contractor is required to prepare and submit the environmental protection plan by an independent environmental engineer, and that is underway right now. So we don't have that final plan prepared, but that is being created as we speak. Next slide, please. And in accordance with the plan to be provided, this will follow all requirements and standards. I mean, HRM as a developer of its own lands does follow the entire process that is in place and regulations that are in place for the private developers. So it's all the same requirements that you would find with the private development world. Next slide, please. So in a question that Tony asked, where will the stormwater be directed? And I guess the quick base answer to that is the development will discharge to its natural location. So that is largely McGregor's Brook with outfall in several locations. As indicated, each drainage basin was designed to mimic the natural drainage area and to limit peak runoff to pre-development conditions. In the short term, prior to sale and development of each individual lot, temporary storage basins have been provided for each lot to reduce the runoff rate to the pre-construction rate. Once the lot is sold, the developer of that lot will be responsible for the permanent stormwater management features, including stormwater retention, to meet the net zero increase in runoff. Next slide, please. If it will be connected to the existing Burnside stormwater system, does that system have adequate capacity? The new collection system is not connected to the existing Burnside collection system. Next slide. And in terms of any new discharge points for stormwater to the natural environment, there are 3 new discharge points to McGregor's Brook. During construction, the contractor will manage runoff via the EPP measures that have been designed for the project. After completion of construction of the development and before the final development of each individual lot, temporary storage ponds have been provided to reduce runoff rate. Final development of the individual lots will require adherence to HRM's policies for net zero runoff and treatment requirements. Next slide, please. And are we at the end, Haruka?
Yes,
Yes, we are.
end of the presentation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Again, sorry, a few details that that John would be able to elaborate on a little bit more if he were able to get the microphone working. Oh, there, I can see his picture. Yeah. Do you have your sound yet, John? I think we're probably not going to get John connected tonight, but I think hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview and some of the questions that you were asking. Again, I guess the key points to the questions are there is certainly going to be a sedimentation and runoff control plan. These large lots, you know, will have measures in place while they're vacant, awaiting the sale, so that the stormwater will be controlled to maintain the natural pre-development flow. And as they're completed, the purchasers of the lots will continue as required under the regulations to develop the lots and control the stormwater to maintain this the system that's in place.
Great, thanks for your presentation, Michael. Sorry that we can't, you're having some difficulties, John. Maybe if there's anything really pressing that you'd like to add, you can type it into the chat. How about we get into our question and comment period? So I'll have a list of everyone's names. So maybe we'll just go down that list. UG, if you'd like to start with any questions or comments.
Sure. One quick question, I guess, just for a point of information. I suppose these are for large commercial developments. Just trying to understand what kind of businesses are we trying to attract for these commercial sites, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, there's quite a wide range of the businesses that HRM tries to provide the land opportunities for. So, I mean, most of the demand currently probably falls within a few categories: logistics, distribution, warehousing, construction industry, of course, is big in HRM. But we have a lot of exciting companies throughout Burnside that do various levels of small scale manufacturing, research, development. So it's really quite a wide range, but you know, we're not really a heavy development city at this point. So you know, the uses in there that are relatively clean, mostly focus on you know, storage, distribution, and warehousing is really the biggest flavor of what you'll find for the tenants that come in the park. We are getting a demand for larger size lots. I mean, the nature of logistics and distribution, of course, and as we can see with some of the unfortunate circumstances in BC, that you know, there's a lot more through the logistics chain of being able to control supply at different routes, store things, last mile of delivery to be able to provide quicker delivery that we're seeing demanded from customer nowadays. So very much a logistics focused world right now.
Thank you. Andrew, any questions or comments?
You said that there's going to be a number of stormwater retention ponds created. Now, this lots as they're sold, depending on what business commercial entity goes in there, I assume there would have to be an adjustment of the stormwater retention ponds given a particular development. So how would that be handled if, you know, if there's a different size structure or different use structure in terms of what kind of discharge will occur?
Yes, and I'm just going to watch to see if John nods no as I give my description of this, but I believe there's only a couple of stormwater ponds that HRM will put in place, and I believe those are to control street runoff and stormwater. But the actual sites themselves will have a requirement for on-site storage and control of their stormwater. So I believe that is most often handled through underground pipes, oversizing of underground pipes, and then the you know, the programmed release, slow release of that stormwater. In the past, you'll find in other sections of Burnside, such as Phase 12, we've had larger stormwater systems in place. And for this type of industrial development, I believe Halifax Water prefers to move away from that type of scenario. So this is more of the optimal solution, I believe, that fits their needs and for the betterment of the stormwater system.
I saw that John added a comment there that each lot will have their own ponds, I guess, once the lots are sold. That's what you meant.
Yeah, so that is the new change. I mean, in the past, you'll see in Phase 12 of Burnside that each independent lot didn't have their own stormwater pond. They would have some on-site control, of course, as I believe is required under regulations, but this will be a new model for Phase 13.
Andrew, do you have any follow-up? No. Tony.
Yes, okay, thanks, Anne. Michael, so that's addressed a number of my questions. Just a couple of follow-up things. Can the board get a copy of that presentation that you provided?
Certainly.
Okay, and I was also going to ask if the board can get a copy of the environmental protection plan once it is finalized. I'm not sure if those documents become public or not.
That I'm not sure either. We'll check into that and see what the normal process is for that, Tony.
Okay. So I guess my question regarding the HRM water quality monitoring, I know, Michael, you're not in a position to be able to address that probably. So I guess I would just ask Emma if, once she's able to find out the information, to provide any follow-up on that, following this meeting. Given my suspicion that the HRM water quality program to monitor lakes is probably not going to be up and running before this activity starts, I also wondered if lake water quality monitoring for at least perhaps Lake William and Lake Thomas could be made a requirement for the contractor to undertake, both prior to and during the clear phase for that area.
I don't think that they would have been awarded their tender, and that wouldn't be a standard requirement for the as of right development. So I don't believe that would be the case.
Michael,
No.
what's the timeline for, sorry to jump in on you, Tony. What's the, like, I didn't catch the time of when this is starting, like construction would hopefully be starting.
Construction, I think it's very, very shortly, isn't it, John? I think we're
Late November, you put in the chat? Okay. I'm also with HRM, so I was just kind of curious.
yes, no, for sure. Yeah. So yeah, certainly, and we had put a contract out several months ago that a portion of phase 13-1 was cleared just to make sure we weren't impacting nesting seasons and whatnot. So some of the clearing has occurred for phase 13-1 prior to now.
Emma, I saw you unmuted earlier. Did you want to address anything else that Tony mentioned about the water quality monitoring?
Yeah, I can. So Tony, we're aiming to get the program started next spring. So if they're starting construction this winter, then we obviously wouldn't be catching that in time. That being said, though, Lake William, Anderson, and I think there's a third lake, Lake Thomas. So those will all be part of the new lake monitoring program. And also I can check to see if they were part of the synoptic survey that started or that ran this past spring. So that's like another program that was a collaborative approach program that was a continuation of a larger DFO study that started decades ago at this point. But I can look into see what data is available for those three lakes.
Okay, yeah, anything that's, providing a background sort of as to the current status would be helpful then once you're up and running next year to see if there's been any change.
Great. Thank you, Emma. All right, where's my list here? Seo, you are next on the list if you have any questions or comments.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So a number of things. I think first off, I don't think that we've thanked Tony for writing this email, which was, I think, really necessary in the circumstances. And thank you for being alert to this, and so that, because so often collectively we tend to sleepwalk into environmental problems. And it's because of citizens like yourself who point out these issues that we might think a bit more deeply before going forward with them. So thank you, Tony. A number of things. As of right development and following the rules, and numerous times during the presentation we talked about following the rules. It reminds me of cigarette companies who say, well, this is a legal product. Following the rules often is not enough. to what extent, are the development companies or the city actively encouraging better than just the legislative requirements is a question I have. We also talked a lot about the volume of water, and of course the volume of water will increase massively. That is on its way to Lake William and beyond because of hardening of surfaces. Whenever you take a raw landscape and you cover it with hard surface roofs and gigantic parking lots, which is the case in the rest of that development, you are orders of magnitude magnifying the volume of water that will need to be treated. All the more so with the climate change events that we've seen, obviously in British Columbia, where things were happening largely because of changes to the land, including in that case draining a lake. Not to be seen as terribly wise decision today. Probably sleepwalked into that one. Don't want to keep sleepwalking into those kind of environmental problems. So volume is one consideration. Another consideration that wasn't talked about is that the water coming off of those parking lots and those roofs will not be as clean as the water that's currently coming down. So it will absorb road salt, it will absorb motor oils, various pollutants along the way. And I think the plan is that that water will not be treated. It will go into what is currently the cleanest lake of the entire chain. I know that simply because I have swum in our various lakes, and I bother to check the Halifax water quality. And in terms of E. coli, it tests really clean like 90% of the time, or it's the best, it's the cleanest lake. So we're going to take the cleanest lake and we're going to harden surfaces, we're going to increase the volume of water, and we're going to replace clean water with polluted water. And that all seems okay, and it's all legal. And that doesn't sit well with me. So, I'm wondering how the city can urge the developers to go far above and beyond what they are legally required to do.
I'm not sure. Was that question for our side or for Emma? I can start from our side just to say thanks very much, and just to clarify, I guess when I was giving my opening remarks and presentation for the some of the things of as of right and per regulation, that's just to clarify, because sometimes people aren't sure if the municipality goes by its own set of rules for these things. So it's just making sure that it's clear that we follow the full process. We're not shortcutting ourselves through the process, that we do follow all required approvals, design stages of the subdivision process, and all provincial requirements as well.
Well, that's comforting. That's comforting to know that you're following the law. Okay.
Yeah, so that was the main point for pointing that out. Yeah.
And of course that there are laws, which is comforting to know.
Yes, exactly. So, HRM's been developing Burnside for a number of years, and I believe in a good, responsible manner. And this will continue. I mean, we try to put forward a good product. As you indicated, there will be some hard surfacing. There will still be a lot of gravel surfacing. Storage yards and whatnot are typically going to be more of the nature of gravel. Having developers more responsible for containing their stormwater is also seen as a positive step forward. In terms of your question for developers overall, I guess I would have to leave that to Emma Waddy's comments on that. I guess, probably the best way, I guess, would be making sure regulations match the desired requirements, I guess would be the best way.
Yeah, just to add on to what Michael said there, there are a lot of opportunities right now with different development agreements to kind of see what's possible to make sure that any water entering a system via kind of new development is as I don't want to say clean because it won't be as pristine as if it was just rainwater, but as pristine, I guess, as it can be given the circumstances. And also, so we have identified that, and we're working with different developers, including those within with our colleagues within HRM as well as others, to kind of see what's possible to kind of to make sure that that can happen. I had another point I was going to make about stormwater. Oh, any like opportunities, like this also kind of ties into other environmental larger impact things that's written like described within Halifax. Any kind of impermeable surface, non-hard surface, yeah, that word, service that can be implemented in different developments. We really are encouraging for that, so that any kind of infiltration can happen through the groundwater and not, or through the ground and not enter directly into the system, as you said it, you know, as you kind of described it could happen. And so we are kind of looking at these different green infrastructure mechanisms to see what's possible and really try to promote those and see those implemented as much as possible too.
Yeah, well, semi-permeable and permeable surfaces are the best answer. So to the extent that that can be encouraged strongly, nobody wants to see Lake William be less than the pristine lake that it is now in terms of water levels or in terms of water quality. That would be tragic, I think. And we should do, you know, what we can to prevent an outcome like that. Is there a Lake William Lake Association? Do we know that? And I guess the second question is, have they been consulted?
I don't believe there is for Lake William.
Okay.
Not to be confused with like Williams Lake, but for
Right.
Lake William, I do not believe there is a community organization.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for your comments, Seo. Thank you, Michael and Emma, for your responses. David, do you have any questions or comments?
Sure. You spoke just in response to a question there about the retention ponds that would be on site on each lot. I'm just wondering how the size of those is determined, the necessary capacity.
Again, John is my engineer for the project, so I'm a little hobbled right now without John's input. But you know, that would be determined by the engineers designing the sites for each purchaser. I mean, you'll have to have the certified engineer design their site plan and control their stormwater drainage appropriately. So that would all be signed off and I believe reviewed. You know, I know. Emma, maybe you can comment on it some. I know Shannon O'Connell's group has been coming up with the new stormwater policy, and that I believe is in effect now, or will about to be in effect. But I know that will have some better control over these situations. I think you know, if you roll back just a couple of years ago, that wasn't in place, and I think there was a little bit of a harder time controlling some of the items from stormwater, perhaps from private developments, and exactly how that integrates with the system.
Okay, I guess.
Certainly. Sorry, go ahead.
I guess I'm curious if those capacities are designed with changes to precipitation patterns in mind, given that these are areas that will probably exist indefinitely. And these, I mean, the ponds could be deepened, I suppose, in the future if it's a per lot basis. But is it built with any kind of climate change modeling in mind to account for bigger events in the future that happen more often?
Yes, I mean, as John's indicating, yes, as per the Halifax Water Climate Change Design Policy. And I know, as John has also prudently indicated, the design for each individual lot has to match pre-developed flows, must match pre-development flows as well. But yes, certainly the Halifax Water Climate Change Policy is part of this.
Okay, thanks. No, I appreciate that. And you can see now why I'm keeping my camera off most of the time. Bit of a case of the sniffle.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, John, for your timely comments in the chat as well. It's been helpful. Okay, I had one quick question that was kind of answered a little bit, but for the stormwater ponds, are they going to be kind of the traditional gray stormwater ponds, or will there be consideration for naturalized stormwater ponds and more kind of green infrastructure solutions? And I think Emma and or Michael mentioned Shannon O'Connell's work with the new stormwater guidelines, and is making it easier to build green infrastructure part of those new guidelines? Oh, up to the lot purchaser.
They will largely be up to the lot purchaser, yes. For those on-site, yes, stormwater ponds. But I mean, everything is evolving. We're currently working with Shannon Miedema's group, environmental group that Emma's part of. I know we've got some projects that we've been talking with them on recently, with some zero carbon projects, and how they may also consider items such as green roofs, other treatments for stormwater. So it's a constantly evolving process. So as we go along, we may put in further requirements of new developments as they go in and as this process evolves.
Okay, that's so currently the requirement for the lot purchaser is that only that flow requirement is met, but potentially in the future there could be other requirements around climate change or green infrastructure, incorporating green infrastructure and things like that. Did I understand that right?
There may be some ability, yes, as we advance. I mean, HRM has tended to adopt the change, quicker than it comes into policy. So as new initiatives are discussed, those may be incorporated.
Okay.
If you can look for an example, I mean, when people first started talking about putting sidewalks in place, HRM started putting those in before they were, or bike lanes. HRM started putting those in Burnside before it became part of the Red Book standards, for instance. So there's just that ability to, to jump on these new initiatives quickly.
Right, when HRM itself is the proponent.
Yes.
Right, okay. Hey, thank you for clarifying that. It's interesting. I didn't realize there was a Halifax Water Climate Change Policy, and I'll be looking into that. That's cool. I'd like to move on to the presentation by Josh and Linda, because I believe Linda is here in the meeting now. Are there any last pressing comments on this this item on Burnside before we move on?
Just very quickly, Emma, just wondering if could, on behalf of the board, could we ask Michael to investigate whether the environmental protection plan could be made available once it's finalized? I know he wasn't sure about that.
Yes, so.
Yeah, so I guess from my point of view, we ought to aim high as a collectivity. We ought to aim high in terms of protecting Lake William, and we should all do our best, whatever our positions are, to encourage things like green infrastructure. Despite the law not requiring it, or whatever the contracts, or as of right development, meaning it's the developer's choice. We shouldn't settle for that as a collectivity. We should aim for the best, and even to be exemplary to other communities, other cities, in how development is done.
Emma, if I may, just want to add a quick comment here. I really appreciate this conversation, especially around stormwater and green infrastructure. It doesn't only have environmental implication, but also economic implication. I work very closely with the technology industry here, and as Michael mentioned, we have new companies moving in and starting advanced manufacturing facility, for example, in Burnside. And if we keep the standard high, that has real implication in terms of business attraction for those high-tech companies to move in, because these companies require a high standard. If there's risk for stormwater, they have multi-million-dollar facility built, and that's a very high risk for them.
And also a reputational risk. Thanks, Eugene. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good. All right, so yeah, I guess as Tony mentioned, if you're able to find out whether you're able to make that report public, we would appreciate that. Thanks everyone for discussion. Thank you very much, John and Michael, and also Emma for answering our questions and providing that presentation. So
Thank you.
we will be moving on to another presentation. You're welcome to leave or stay or whatever you wish, but thank you for joining us this evening. All right, so we are going back to item 8.3.1, a presentation entitled Uncovering Long-Term Impacts of Historical Gold Mining Practices in Modern HRM Lakes Through Sediment Analyses. So I'd like to invite Joshua Couric and Linda Campbell to present. So it seems like they each have their own presentation. So I'm not sure who is planning to go first.
I will be first. Linda here. I see a lot of familiar faces in the meeting, so it's nice to see everybody again. And I think Josh is here. I see him there. Okay. So I will do the first part of the presentation to provide background of the history of gold mining, the issues, and then I will turn that over to Josh, and he will talk about the specific project that focused on Lake Charles and Moon Lake. So, and it looks like I'm in a dark room. I'm actually in a boardroom at St. Mary's, but it's quite dark outside. We are working with two staff interpreters with the university, and they're facilitating access between ASL and English for everybody in the meeting. All right, and so is everybody able to hear us okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great, so I'll start us off with the presentation. You can see the picture here that is on your screens, and this is from Dartmouth, not too far from Highway 7, actually. And so this is an image of Montague Gold Mines. And you will see what is here is tailings. And the reason why I selected this picture to kick us off this evening is this was taken in the springtime, late spring, and the water is then starting to move along the surface of the tailings, and the water carries the particulates with it within that watershed as it moves. And so I will show you some maps as we get into the presentation that shows it a little bit more from an aerial perspective, but this is that impact picture of actually seeing what it looks like on the ground. Harold, can you go to the next slide, please? And some background for gold mining and the history of gold mining in the province, but I will very much emphasize something critical, that the historical practices for gold mining are different than the modern practices that are happening for gold mining. And we're not talking at all about the modern practices, we're focused on the historical practices. The history of gold mining here in Nova Scotia is from the 1860s until just prior to World War II. And you can see here on the graph, which is the amount of gold produced in the province per year. And so we had 3 gold rushes in the province, and you can see the peaks of those rushes, and that corresponds with the time that those occurred. And we look at the left, where there's the map of Nova Scotia, and you can see 2 types of geological formations for the province that holds gold. And so black stars indicate where the largest productions regions of gold were. And there were 64 gold districts in the province historically, and about 360 mines that have been counted and documented to date. And so it's pretty much widespread across Nova Scotia. It's not unique just to Halifax. Next slide, please. And so what did that process look like? This is a very important picture to illustrate that. And so what you're seeing here is inside the stamp mill. And at the back, you can see a 5 stamp mill battery. And what the stamps did is they're very heavily weighted and they crush the ore into a very fine powder. And what they would do with that fine powder is use fresh water to carry that powder over a copper plate that was coated with mercury. And then they would scrape off that mercury from the plate. The mercury amalgamated the gold out of the ore as it was being flushed over. And then they would heat up that scraped off material. And they would heat the mercury, evaporate that off, and capture that for use again. And then what was left in that gold, and then that later would be purified. And so that is the process of amalgam. And so there's 3 plates, as you can see here. There's the shaking tables. And so they would do that scraping process continuously. And then what was left at the end of that was waste material called tailings. So there was mercury involved, but we're also concerned about the arsenopyrite as well. And if you can look at the picture here at the top right, and my view is being covered by everyone else's faces, but for you it should be on the left top. The right top is a picture of a core, and an individual is pointing to a piece of arsenopyrite. And that's naturally co-occurring with gold. And that's a lot of arsenic inside of that chunk of core. And so we have a double whammy at play here. So we have the introduced mercury for that amalgamation process, and then the geologically forming arsenic that then has been ground to the fine powder, exposing it for arsenopyrite. And what's also really important for this picture is that they needed fresh water for this process to make this whole process work. And so where they got the fresh water from, and I'm sure you can make a pretty good guess of where they would get that from. Next slide, please. And so what they did with that waste material and that waste water was they just dumped it back to where they found it, which was typically low-lying, shallow areas, wetlands, lakes, and streams. And it's been there for over 100 years. Next slide, please. And so this is a widespread problem for the province. The tailings are very mobile, and every time that there's a flood or a rain event or snow melt, the tailings move at each time, and they typically move downstream, and they typically get captured and held in those wetland areas. And so that's where my research group is focused their energies on. There's a lot of questions that we need to answer, and we're not yet in the position to answer them, but we are working hard on it. Next slide, please. To give you an idea, in the HRM, we have Montague and Waverley, which is at the lower portion of your screen. And then we have other gold mining districts along the Shubenacadie Canal system. And each is separate, each had their own corporation and business working. Some of them were working better than others for their processes. But you can see the picture in the lower section of the image at the very bottom. That's Barry's Run, and that enters Lake Charles. And you can see the tailings moving along the water. And then the purple flowers with the broken down truck, that image That is at Oldham, which is very close to the Halifax Stanfield Airport. And then at the very lowest left corner is an image of tailing material, and that core is showing it, and it's a very fine material, very consistently fine, and it moves very quickly. Next slide, please. And so I do want to emphasize that the mining itself did not cause the contamination, but the process of extracting the gold and becoming tailing material, that is what we're concerned about. Another thing that we do need to remember is the chemistry of arsenic and mercury are very different from each other. You can't assume that one and the other would act the same. With arsenic, it is very sensitive to oxygen concentrations and iron concentrations. It's very mobile within lakes, and it's an immediate toxicity depending on the speciation of arsenic. When we look at mercury, the toxicity is not as immediate, but if it has more chronic exposure, it will bioaccumulate and magnify the food chain. And so we're monitoring both the arsenic and mercury. We have to keep the different parameters and functions of them in mind because they are different. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our study area, from what we're focused on for today's presentation, the red stars, and we're looking at Mitchell Brook. That connects to Loon Lake and Lake Charles through Barry's Run. We have sampled the Mitchell Brook connection for many years now. We plan to continue going back until about 2026. And so I'm going to show you a few of the results from the macroinvertebrate studies that we've done. I won't go through all of the data that we have, but the macroinvertebrates, and I picked those for a reason because they do connect very well with the coring study that we did. And so that's why I spoke with Josh about working on the coring study for this area. Next slide, please. This macroinvertebrate study is based on many different locations across the province. And if you look at the bottom, you can see OS. That is our name for one of the sites within Montague. It's a very old site that had very initial mining practices, and they were just learning how to use mercury amalgamation at that time. And on the far left, there are two reference sites. And the reference site is Mitchell Brook, which is close to Loon Lake, which is above Montague. So you can see that the mercury concentrations within vertebrates for multiple species is significantly higher than looking at the old stamp mill, the OS, and we compare those to the reference sites, we can see the vast difference. So we can say that the invertebrates are bioaccumulating mercury from the tailing impacted wetlands. Next slide, please. For arsenic, we weren't able to do the analysis for as many samples because the mass needed for analysis is greater than that of mercury. So we grouped them by larger samples. You can see the images on the side there of the species. So we have amphipods, spiders, and dragonfly nymphs. And so the amphipods are omnivores, spiders are predators and piercers, and then dragonflies are carnivores. We did not see any evidence of biomagnification of arsenic through the food chain, but there are bioaccumulation of arsenic. Biomagnification means that up the food chain, it will increase with each trophic level, where bioaccumulation is any source of a way for it to accumulate water, etc. And if you look at the numbers of arsenic concentrations, 100 to 750 parts per million, They are all above the Health Canada guidelines for seafood. For mercury, the exposed sites are all above the Health Canada's guideline for fish consumption. So it is a concern. Next slide, please. And so we wanted, at the time we pondered, are these insects that are emerging from the aquatic life stage into adults, for example. Adults, they live in the aquatic stage for about 3 years, and then they will emerge as adults and live for a few weeks, and then start their life process all over again. And so we wanted to see if the dragonfly juveniles that were exposed to mercury and arsenic within wetlands in their aquatic stage are carrying those contaminants out of the ecosystem as they emerge. So we captured the juvenile invertebrates and we set up floating traps to capture the adults of the same species. Next slide, please. I won't show you too many graphs, but this is an infographic that summarizes all of the data from this master student. And so we have the aquatic cycle, we look at the larvae up to the emerging adult, and we also analyze the casings of these larvae that as they emerge, they lose their casings. And we found about 86% of the mercury remains within the adults as they emerge, which is a significant amount of our mercury. And then for arsenic, it is a better story. They lose about 93% of the arsenic through their casing. It's held in their casing. And so only 7% remains within the adults as they emerge. But if you remember the slide that I was showing you about the amount of arsenic within those organisms between 100 and 750 parts per million. So when we do the math of what that 7% of that amount is, it's still above that 3.5 parts per million guideline from Health Canada for seafood consumption. So dragonflies are a potentially very important source of mercury and arsenic through the food web that is outside of the wetland. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that yes, there is a concern. What are the implications and risks for human health and so forth? We're not able to comment on those right now, but we can talk about the ecosystem and how the moving within the ecosystem. And we'll talk about the history of how that is impacting the lake ecosystems throughout time as well. Next slide, please. And so this is where I'm going to segue into Josh's portion of the presentation. So Josh's team and my team has worked together on coring Loon Lake and Lake Charles. And we wanted to see if the concentrations in Loon Lake and Lake Charles reflect the input from Montague. And whether that's changing through time as well. And so I'll give you some background and high level summary and about the issue and concerns. And then I'll turn it over to Josh to talk about specifically about this study. And so I think we're at the point we can turn it over to Josh.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. That's a really good start to this, Linda. I think it's really interesting where we look at these long-term historical land use changes, and we combine sediments, we combine water quality data, we combined ecological data like Linda just presented, and we're really starting to get the pieces together of this complex puzzle of what's going on when landscapes and different activities happen in and around our fresh waters. And I understand that your advisory board is sort of discussing these issues, and it's neat to hear some of these discussions tonight. So I'm going to talk about what sediments tell us about lake health, and in particular, I'm going to focus on two lakes that Linda and I have worked on with students and others recently, Lake Charles and Loon Lake in the HRM. And all of us probably recognize that some type of systematic monitoring is often needed to understand whether aquatic systems are changing or how their health is impacted by human activities. And there's a variety of things that we often use in combination. Typical water quality surveys. We can model how systems might respond to different stressors or inputs. We can look at some historical records. We can use the traditional ecological knowledge and what others have observed in and around the watersheds. These are all very important. And I'm going to specifically focus on sediments as a kind of a natural archive of past conditions. So next slide, please. So here's a picture from us. I think it was early May in 2019. We're in about the 30-meter deep basin of Lake Charles, and that's the 30 or 40 centimeter core that we collected from there. And we're really interested in the sediments because they help us to understand the history of lakes. And whenever we're using the sediments to understand environmental changes, we're not just making one measure, we're making several different measures. These could be physical measures from the sediments, chemical or biological measures. Next slide, please. So lakes are great archives of what's happening in the climate system, what's happening around within their watersheds, and also what's happening within the water column. They accumulate all these environmental processes through time in an orderly fashion. And so that allows us to collect a sediment core from usually the deep basin in the lake and reconstruct past conditions and compare those to how the lake looks nowadays. Next slide, please. And so I think we would all acknowledge that more monitoring efforts are often needed. And in the absence of these systematic monitoring efforts, we need some kind of indirect way to understand how systems behave through time. And so we can use our sediments to do this. And there's the core you can see from Lake Charles. You can clearly see that contact there of the organic rich sediments at the bottom of the core with presumably tailings that were moved from the Montague site through Barry's Run into Lake Charles. And so that provides that really clear visual contact of when mining started. When we actually age the sediments, that dates to about 1860, plus or minus some years, but we're right in the ballpark of when mining occurred in that catchment. So we use the lake sediments to understand what were conditions like in Lake Charles before mining occurred, and also to understand some of the natural variability that we might see or expect in lake systems. And particularly, we're interested in changes through time. And so have conditions in the lake changed? Which direction are they headed in? And if we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together with these physical, geochemical, biological measures, you can really start to understand maybe why. But that's still challenging, considering that we're going back in time, in this example, about 150 years or so. Next slide, please. So there's been a number of kind of what I think is critical sediment studies for your group to really think about, and these often inform on one another. And there's lots of other great work done by other organizations, not just academics, but federal and provincial groups, partners at other universities, watershed groups. There's the surveys that Emma mentioned earlier by DFO that have occurred in HRM lakes for, I think it's their 4th decade. And so it's really nice to see those continue. But all of this information really helps us to understand how our aquatic systems are behaving. And so I'll just point out these 3 studies, and then I'll talk about the recent one that Linda and I and others were involved in. And so the Brian Ginn study is really great because they did survey all of these roughly 50 lakes in the HRM that are constantly being kind of visited every 10 years or so for the DFO synoptic survey, which to my understanding has been taken over by some academic partners at DAL, which is nice to see. And I think there's a recent study coming out of Dalhousie with Acadia Partners as well, by Dewey Dunnington, looking at kind of land use change and development around, I think, 6 or 8 lakes in the HRM. Some of those I've heard you mention tonight, and that's a really good perspective that's provided by these historical changes that we all know has happened at many of these lakes in the area: deforestation, canal building, highway upgrades, and all of this stuff. And so it's really good to see how those signals are reflected in the sediments. And Dr. Dunnington and others did a nice job on that paper. And that brings us to our study, where we're really we're using this kind of reference lake approach with Loon Lake, and we're comparing the trends through time at that system with neighboring Lake Charles, which receives tailings through Barry's Run from the Montague Gold District. Next slide, please. And so this is just the basic study design there. We have our core location at Loon Lake in black. We've got our core location in the 30-meter deep basin at Lake Charles. And then I'm just pointing out some of the other work that colleagues at Acadia University, Dr. Spooner, has done, I think, through, I'm familiar with these data through a Dillon Consulting report that came out a few years ago that's very extensive in looking at some of these systems. And I think our findings and our approach differ a bit, and I think that's worth pointing out. We actually have ages on our sediment intervals where a lot of previous studies, not just the Acadia studies, but those done by Tom Clare and other federal government workers, they didn't age the sediments, and they used other techniques to infer what the ages are. But I think it's important to date sediment cores so you really have an understanding of the timing of changes that can become important. And nowadays, everything's getting more and more complex, and that's often why we work with lots of different partners who have that expertise. In particular, Linda's expertise with some of those contaminants like mercury and arsenic comes in handy when we try to put all of these measures together and interpret the changes through time. So at our cores, we've done a full workup of elemental analysis using the kind of gold standard ICP-MS measures. We've compared that with kind of more non-destructive rapid techniques, XRF fluorescence there. And those measures are summarized in supplementary information in our paper, which is kind of eye-opening. And we can compare some of those measures, those XRF measures that Acadia's used and produced in their cores with what we've done from Lake Charles too. And then we've got a lot of other important ecological information that's preserved in the sediments, like past lake production through pigments that preserve in the sediment records. So if lakes are becoming more productive through time, then you'd expect to see greater amounts of chlorophyll A preserved in the sediments. And then we've got our key bioindicators, just like Linda's interested in how macroinvertebrates living in nearby wetlands may bioaccumulate, biomagnify, and then move the contaminants out of these former tailing sites into the terrestrial environment. We've got an ecological signal through the fossil remains of zooplankton and benthic invertebrates that live in the bottom of these lakes. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of information presented in this graphic, but I just want to highlight this. So this is the reference lake. This is Loon Lake. This was a system that is not downstream of the mining site. And so on the vertical axis, we've got our ages. So going from roughly modern times all the way back to the late 1800s. And each of those little graphs there, the black histograms, they represent the relative abundance of a zooplankton species. And you can see their abundance fluctuates through time. But around 1950 is a key point at the reference site. And in our interpretations of the data, the geochemical, the ecological data, the chlorophyll A record that you can see presented there, we really think that this site's a key reflection of what's happening in and around it, being the urbanization and recent climate change, which is driving these shifts in bioindicators. These are pretty strong shifts. And we've got our geochemical measures there too. Just to note that they are relatively low, below, at least for mercury, well below sediment quality guidelines. And arsenic, they're around the sediment quality guidelines, which in a lot of natural lake systems, irrespective of whether mining has occurred around them or not, sometimes we do see slightly elevated levels of some contaminants in the sediments. It's just the natural component to this element. The geology in and around that area is rich in arsenic, and that's why the mines were put there. So the reference lake shows a kind of a classic urbanization climate change signal in the recent times. Next slide, please. And here's our impact lake. Again, this was a core from 30 meters deep, or 28 meters deep, so a fairly deep basin in the lake. On the right-hand side of the diagram, we've got our contaminants of concern, mercury and arsenic, and as Linda pointed out, they behave very differently in the aquatic ecosystem. So mercury shows that classic increase in inputs when mining was occurring, and then the slow decline through time. And from a sediment perspective, mercury's recovered to roughly the levels that it was at pre-mining times, which are below the sediment quality guidelines. Now, arsenic presents a very different story at this site. And we're still trying, this work is ongoing. We're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. But our highest measured values of arsenic are in several near surface sediment samples. So arsenic being in those surface sediments at the very top of the core, right near the sediment water interface. We're seeing extremely high arsenic values, 300 times greater than levels which evidence suggests harm sediment dwelling organisms. And the shifts in the bioindicators at Lake Charles aren't as striking as those at the reference lake, but each lake often shows kind of lake specific behavior patterns, but it's not so much the dominant pelagic species that change. It's more of those bioindicators, the zooplankton that aren't living in the open water column, but are that are associated with the sediments. So the next slide, please. So when we look at the graphs there that you see from Charles and Loon Lake, when you look at the trends through time, so when you compare the number of zooplankton that you see in intervals that date to the pre-mining period with the mining period, with the post-mining period at these lakes, the real striking difference is that at the impacted Lake Charles, we're losing organisms. So there's a fairly large loss of diversity. And when you dig into the data, some of which I haven't presented here, but when you dig into the data, it's those taxa that are associated with substrates. So those are the organisms that are likely being exposed to the greatest level of contaminants. But these lakes are not only responding to historical mining and the delivery of those contaminants into the system. There's a lot of evidence also that urbanization has impacted these systems, along with climate change. And some of those other studies that I pointed out earlier, and some of the water quality surveys that have been done in that area, they really reinforce those ideas. So just to summarize some of our findings to date, both the geochemical and the ecological recovery of these lakes has really, it hasn't occurred despite the mines closing, over 80 years ago. we see a loss of diversity at the impact lake, and although we do see a community shift at Loon Lake, there's still roughly similar diversity and similar numbers of organisms there. And both of the lakes show signals in their ecology, or in the ecological remains that we see in the fossils, and also with our chlorophyll A that we attribute to probably pressures from urbanization in and around the lake, but also longer growing seasons and changes to lake mixing through climate warming. And one of the things that Linda and I are interested in trying to work towards understanding, and it's nice to see that your crew kind of brought that up, I think, in some of your discussions, is we tend to think of pollution as often being visible at the surface of lakes, but what's really important, especially at some of these large, deeper lakes, is what's going on at the very bottom, at the deepest waters, and how well oxygenated are they. And we know that as you change land use patterns in and around systems and you extend growing seasons, you're probably going to lead to depletion of oxygen. And so if depletion of oxygen in the bottom waters of these lakes allows how arsenic is bound up into the sediments to become more mobile, that may move this contaminant up the sediments, closer to the sediment water interface, and possibly even releasing from the sediments into the water column. So this is the type of work that Linda and I and others working on this project are trying to understand, and it's complex and it's interesting. I tend to work on remote lakes that are in the middle of nowhere, often because it's easier to understand changes through time, because you can disentangle the urbanization from what's going on in the climate system, from what's going on known stressors. But some of these HRM lakes, like Lake Charles and Loon Lake, they're really interesting from this type of perspective. And Linda and I just last week, we were out at near I think Williams Lake. I think we were just above Williams Lake collecting samples from Lake Thomas and Muddy Pond to do similar studies as we've done with Charles and Loon Lake. So I'll end it here, and thanks for asking us to present.
Hey, thank you very much for those presentations. That was very informative, and I learned a lot. And yeah, it's fascinating to see everyone involved in this research and how all the different pieces fit together. I really liked the infographic with the dragonfly and the percentages of arsenic and mercury coming out. That's particularly interesting to me. So we have a bit of time now for any questions. How about if anyone has a question, if you can use the raise hand function, we'll go from there. David, go ahead. Thanks.
Hi there. I don't actually have a question, but I do have to jump off. I wanted to thank both of you, Linda and Josh, very much for the presentation. It's really interesting to see how these systems are studied and the effects. So thank you again very much. And I'll look forward to hopefully running into you in the future. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, David. Seo, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Yeah, so amazing presentations, the graphics, the explanations, obviously the thought that went into those presentations, just really remarkable. So thanks to both Linda and Josh for those presentations. Where the rubber hits the road often here in sort of the board's world is development. And as I'm sure you know, there's a proposed development, or has it reached that level? I'm not sure, but eventually the city would love to develop the part of the world, which is Port Wallace, I believe it's called, Is that right? Which is in that area?
Yes.
Of the gold.
Yes, it is the exact same system, yes.
Yeah. So the question for us, we're always concerned about stormwater and changes to the land patterns and hardening of surfaces, and how that affects water flows and whether those water flows could increase the pollution. Another aspect that's been brought up by Andrew and myself, I'm not a scientist, but of course Andrew is, and you both are, the possibility that development in Port Wallace will lead to further phosphorus loadings. Phosphorus loadings lead to more algae. Algae decomposition leads to deoxygenation. Deoxygenation, as you pointed out in your presentation, risks. And you were certainly, you let us know that it's, you're still looking at that, but a possible liberation of arsenic into the water column. So, I mean, if either of you could comment on, what is the risk in terms of phosphorus, increased phosphorus loadings, causing the problems that we know, including, of course, algal blooms, which we've seen too many of in this region, and the further problem, potential problem, in this particular lake of arsenic being liberated from the lake bottom.
And thank you very much for the question. What you're asking is very complex. I could teach an entire course just on that particular topic. You mentioned about phosphorus. Phosphorus is another interesting element related to arsenic. And so we typically look at arsenic, and we would both then also look at iron and phosphorus. The iron from a geochemistry perspective, because they typically co-occur, and phosphorus from a biological perspective. Arsenic and phosphorus actually compete and to the same binding sites physiologically. And so you're asking us, what are the risks? And it's a really challenging one to answer, because with all of those elements within one system that are being contended with, oxygen impacts all three of those elements as well. And so if it becomes phosphate and the oxygen is decreased, it could encourage more production of algae. And then that could lead to more uptake of arsenic through the food. That's all speculation. And so it comes back to us that we need more data. We need to understand the water chemistry, how the water is moving hydraulically, and then model the phosphorus within Barry's Run and Lake Charles. And modeling with the impacts of development coming down, the impacts of Barry's Run, and what the impacts to water chemistry is, and how that all enters Lake Charles. So we could speculate all night on what it could be, but it goes back to having really good modeling for this. And so that's really important. And I've been wanting to ask for more information. If I was in your position, I would ask for more information as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, if you change the landscape in and around a system, as you said, and you harden surfaces, you put in more residences, more businesses, you change the way that surface water moves through stormwater drains or channels or stormwater ponds, you're going to impact water quality. There's no question about it. So if I was a resident on Lake Charles and they're going to be developing in an area around that, maybe that lake now is on the cusp of seeing more frequent algal blooms. And so factored in extensive development along with climate change, and you've got a little bit of a recipe for concern there, I think. I think it's much more tricky to figure out how the contaminants are going to behave. But if you're just looking at water quality in general, I mean, I think we already know what's going to happen when you put in another, I don't know what's the size of these developments, a couple hundred houses and some businesses and some roads and driveways and everything. I think we know the answer to that question as to what the water quality will look like in Lake Charles in a couple of years or a couple decades.
Hey, yeah, thanks for those comments. I just want to point out that we are at 6:50 now. So definitely Tony and Andrew, if you have any comments, I do want to make sure we end on time out of respect for everyone's time, but Andrew, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I just, Josh, the deposition of arsenic material to Lake Charles, from what I understand from your work, is still technically ongoing, even though the development has ceased. So, there's both the legacy of the contamination, but then there's the ongoing potential mobilization of the contamination. So, if water quality is degraded, which we can be fairly certain will happen if there's developments that enter the lake, what's the risk when that lake system becomes anoxic?
Yeah, I think that's the real question. If the arsenic is bound up in the sediments and slowly then is released into the water column, are we going to see, tremendous increases in the concentration of arsenic dissolved in the water, or not? I mean, again, that's not my expertise. You probably need to go to like a geochemical modeler to get at that. But I think largely what we're seeing at Lake Charles, it is the historical inputs of arsenic, and they've slowly moved up the core. There probably still are some tailings moving in from the Montague district, and that can be through surface water, but let's not forget about the wind as well. Like Linda showed pictures of these are very, very fine dusts. And so you get these dry conditions and the winds whipping up, and you will move those contaminants around that way as well. So I think most of what we're seeing in the sediments was deposited there a long time ago and is just mobilized, because that's how arsenic behaves. It's very complex and sensitive to the conditions in the sediments and at the very, very bottom of the lake. It's less clear to me, and this is what you're getting at, is if oxygen becomes consistently depleted in that lake at, say, the end of summer, will more arsenic be released into the water column? It's less clear to me. But I mean, those are the types of studies that can easily be done. We can collect in situ measures of oxygen from these lakes, and we can release devices down there that collect the water from 30 meters down, and we can measure the arsenic. So we can look at the timing of the loss of oxygen, how much arsenic is released. It's just a matter of the will and the right people that want to do those types of
Josh,
studies.
if I may just add to that as well, Josh, there is data for arsenic in water for Lake Charles available, and it's been collected by DFO in their synoptic studies and some private consulting reports and so forth. So there is some data out there. But one thing that they do have in common is that they typically sample the water only once or a few times, but they're not monitoring it and looking at temporally through time the changes. And they're not looking at oxygen and pH, phosphorus, all of those along with their arsenic. So we're missing that piece. And so what's happening when the water is warming up? We don't know. We're missing that data. And so that data is necessary to answer the questions that are being asked of us now. But there is data out there. It's just, it's a little patchy. Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds like there's lots of continue a discussion maybe around this topic. It's very interesting. And I did notice in the last regional council meeting, there was a staff report brought forward relating to the Port Wallace development. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that, and perhaps at a future RRAD meeting, we can have the staff who wrote that report present and get the late, now that it's in the public realm, I suppose, now that it's being presented to council, they might be in a better position to give an update on the Port Wallace development and their ongoing work with environment and climate change, Nova Scotia Lands, and Lands and Forestry, or DNRR, on where that development stands. So I'd like to move on, but thank you very much, Linda and Josh, for presenting tonight and for answering questions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for coming. We really appreciate your expertise and knowledge. So we have one last quick agenda item, and it's just to approve the 2022 board meeting schedule. So I just need a mover and a seconder. The meeting schedule was sent out with the meeting agenda, and I think it's to continue to have the meeting on the second Thursday of every month. So do I have a mover?
I can move that.
And Andrew seconds. Perfect. So the motion is that the Regional Watersheds Advisory Board approve the proposed 2022 meeting schedule as presented. Are there any opposed? Okay, so the motion carries. Yeah, so we don't have any agenda items for the December meeting. Do we want to look into this Port Wallace staff report? I can send it to the committee. Would we be interested in those 3 or 4 of us that are left? Would we be interested in having a presentation to kind of further our discussion? Okay, so Haruka, maybe myself and Tony will be in touch with you about that, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, this is adjournment. Hope everyone has a great rest of your evening and a great weekend. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Night.